Very good afternoon to all who have signed in to this session of our CSIS-GRIPS-RSIS Policy Research Network on Contemporary Southeast Asia. My name is Hua Chongguan. I'm a senior fellow at the S. Raja School of International Studies and delighted to be your moderator for this afternoon when we have a session by Dr. Jayant Menon, who is a visiting fellow at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, to discuss with us pandemic fallout, disruptive technologies, and divergent demographics, policy challenges facing countries in the Indo-Pacific, and thereafter comments and discussions from Professor Sujiro Urata, Professor Emeritus at Waseda University, Japan, and Dr. Rizal Damuri, who is with the Economics Department, Head of the Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia. But first, I'd like to invite Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS, to say a few words of welcome. Ambassador Ong.
Thank you. I hope all of you can hear me. Warmest greeting to all of you joining us today for this seminar on the web. Today we are looking at this important topic of the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, which came with also an accelerated progression towards more digital application in our life, in our business, in our society, in our economy. So there must be a lot of consequential repercussions, consequential policy development, and consequential way in which we look at the future. Yeah. So we have all these experts to give us a bit more enlightenment and perhaps some food for thought. And all of you who are participating are welcome to offer your comments, your views, and so that we can have a very good discussion. After all, this particular network, we call it the Policy Research Network on Contemporary Southeast Asia, is designed for all of us to look at contemporary development and the consequences that we will expect from such development and how our respective system of governance deal with all these development and consequences. So it is important that we have this initiative because our life is being changed, yeah. And Dr. Jayant Menon today and Professor Sujiro Urata, together with Dr. Yose Rizal Daimuri from CSIS Indonesia, will be giving us some suggestions of how they see this going forward. Yeah. What is the effect on what we know very much as multilateralism and globalization, especially with regard to the trading system that we have around the world? What is the impact of the digitalization on our future of work, especially our jobs, employment, and what do we do with those who are not yet skillful enough and needing more training, and so on. So these are important questions for us to ponder as we hope for the day the COVID-19 pandemic becomes more manageable. Right now, it is seemingly difficult to ascertain how wide, how deep some of the coronavirus will penetrate. Yeah, but let us spend these few hours listening to the experts, and hopefully we can benefit from their ideas and discussion, and we have a better sense of where we are heading. For me, what I like most about this topic is that we are going to talk about the future of labor movement, the future of skill training, the future of education. These are all essentials for our society's future and for our respective country to continue the progress towards economic development, technology, harnessing, and better life. So, without further ado, I thank you again for being here, and back to you, Cheong Guan.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Ong, for getting us started thinking on these issues. And now I invite Dr. Jayant Menon to give us his thoughts on this issue of pandemic fallouts, disruptive technologies, and divergent demographics. Dr. Menon, the screen is yours for the next 30 minutes or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you also, Ambassador Ong, for setting the stage very nicely for me to pick up on these issues. I'm very pleased to be back involved in this network again. I remember it seems like a long, long time ago now, but it was only just a couple of years ago we all gathered in Singapore, face to face in a different world at that time, to talk about a lot of these issues. In fact, I made a presentation together with Professor Urata on some of the emerging trends in the region. And that presentation today will probably have very little value. Things have changed so much in this short period of time as COVID has almost taken over our lives. Certainly, lots of things have changed, but many things also haven't changed. COVID has accelerated a number of trends, but not completely overhauled our thinking on so many important long-term trend issues, which I want to touch upon today. So let me start sharing my screen, and I'm sure you'll tell me if you cannot see it or if anything goes wrong, but otherwise I'll assume you can. So this paper, thank you, that I wrote specific for purpose when Ambassador Ong asked me to look at some of the longer term trends in this region and how we should start thinking about them and responding to them. And so I thought these were the ones that came to my mind. Firstly, of course, is the pandemic itself and the fallout. So I'll start by quickly describing some of these things. These are all familiar to you, so I won't spend too much time on it. And then I want to look at a post-pandemic recovery, starting with how we immediately prepare for it now, which is starting to think about opening borders. Then I want to focus on the main themes, which is digital disruption, especially to labor markets, and on top of that, the other long-term trend, which is divergent demographics. Of course, we all know there's one more in all of this, which is the climate change, but there's not enough time to cover that one. That is a separate important issue in its own right. But these are the two trends I think we must face in the medium term going forward. And so I'll finish off by looking at what policy needs to do as we think about coming out of this pandemic and facing the new normal. Okay, so firstly, we remind ourselves it doesn't need much reminding, but the pandemic is still very much with us. This is what it looks like around the world. Lighter is better. You can see that Asia is still light in some spots, but dark in others. This is changing rapidly, and I think we know that a lot still lies ahead of us in terms of coming out of this pandemic, especially in this region. In this region, we are not leaving the pandemic, but the pandemic is peaking in many countries in ASEAN and in Asia. And so the worst is hitting us right now. You can see this in these charts. These are for the ASEAN countries that had community outbreaks at the early part of this pandemic. You can see all the lines are starting to rise again more recently. Even for those that didn't have much of a problem at the start, they are facing it now. This is from a few weeks ago, but from a few days ago, this is a situation with mortality rates in ASEAN. And I think the mortality rates are what inevitably matter. This pandemic is worse when it kills us. And you can see here again the horrible situation with Indonesia and Philippines with very high rates of mortality. Malaysia sharply picking up, which has been widely reported, very sad situation. This is Myanmar here in dark orange, I guess, which interestingly, the mortality rate stopped rising when the coup happened. So you can read that what you will. And then, but it's still high and it started to rise apparently only recently. And in all other countries, except for a couple like Singapore and Brunei, we can see it rising. So the pandemic is very much with us, and we need to bear that in mind in talking about a post-pandemic new normal. Okay, so now on the economic impacts, here are the latest forecasts from the IMF and from ADB. For the IMF, the world this year is expected to grow at 6% after having contracted by 3.3 last year, and then tapering off a bit to 4.4 next year. Within ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, there's quite a bit of variation. We know last year the Philippines had the deepest recession, and then in the broader region, India did very badly, and China surprised on the upside. And this year, China is expected to grow even more rapidly, very rapidly at above 8%. But the world is growing faster because the industrialized economies, the US and EU, are expected to bounce back strongly. The EU, that should be minus 6.6, last year, and the US minus 3.5 last year. The EU is expected to grow at 4.4 this year. I can't remember when they last grew at that rate, and the US as well. So a lot of variation within ASEAN, but generally bounce back quite strongly expected this year, and then further strong growth the year after, unlike the rest of the world, which is likely to taper off in 2022. Okay, these are some quarterly numbers, actual growth year on year for countries in ASEAN that report quarterly numbers. You can see broadly there's sort of like a V-shaped recovery, if you like, with the bottom being hit in Q2 of 2020 last year, and then things improving, although you can see it's not uniform. Countries that have been struggling with the community transmission for a while, recovery remains a bit uncertain, the shape of the recovery at least. I think we will not find a new bottom that's already passed in Q2 last year, because that's when the longest lockdowns were in place. It looks like recovery is underway, but uncertainties remain. Vietnam, of course, never had even a single quarter of negative growth, but then now, like everyone, just about everyone in the region, is dealing with the Delta outbreak. Trade has been an important part of the story. It has supported recovery, but also minimized the downturns. You can see here that this is monthly data. The green line is developing Asia, fell the least. G3, which is the orange line, fell the most. The world in between is the average. So trade has supported recovery, but also minimized the falls. And a lot of it because of the supply chains. Demand for PPE and electronics has been strong, stronger than ever before. And so this has helped us minimize the downturn and helped with recovery. That's trade in goods. Of course, as we know, trade in services, especially traditional people-to-people movement, has collapsed because of border closures, especially in Asia. In the US and Europe, things are opening and travel is resuming for non-essential activities. But this appears, very far away still in Asia, especially with the new variants. And also because vaccination rates have lagged far behind Europe and the US. The outstanding performer, of course, is Singapore, that's hoping to get to 50% of its population fully vaccinated by the end of this month, on track to do that, and is progressing well. Second place is surprisingly Cambodia, also doing quite well, with a huge supply of vaccine from China, and looking to reach herd immunity before the end of the year. But in other countries, it's mixed and slow. Some are very slow. So there's a lot of catch up here compared to the US and EU, and of course, other outliers like Israel and so on that have done extremely well. So a long way to go with Asia. There's been issues with supply, of course, but there's also logistical issues, and to some extent there's also been vaccine hesitancy in places like the Philippines that needs to be overcome. Right. So we need a lot of work still to be done, but restrictions generally on domestic movement have been falling throughout Asia over time as lockdown fatigue sets in, but borders have remained mostly little changed, closed throughout this period. So there is a growing asymmetry between the border restrictions and internal movement. And this has, when there were signs that this asymmetry might narrow, the new variants dashed all hope of border openings. In fact, even for the vaccinated, cross-border travel, non-essential travel remains on the far horizon. But I think we should remind ourselves that the selective travel bans that were put in place when the new variants first started did not prevent the entry of new variants. In the end, it was domestic protocols that provided the ultimate safeguard. So testing, tracing, and efficient quarantine is what will protect you from the original or the new variants. Sure, the travel bans can provide an additional layer of protection, especially in countries where domestic protocols are weak, but it will not stop the new variants from coming in. And in fact, it hasn't. They will find a way in, even in countries that have almost completely sealed their borders, like Australia and New Zealand. The new variants have come in. You cannot almost completely seal. Unless you completely seal, even the slightest break or opening will allow the new variants to seep in. That's been the experience. So we cannot use that as a premise for keeping borders closed indefinitely. But we also cannot open indiscriminately. But I think it's time to start preparing to open in a careful and calibrated way as we go forward. Sure, we can't do anything right now while the new variants are raging, but that too will come under control. And when it does, we must start thinking about new ways of opening borders if we are to ever start overcome this pandemic and start living with this as an endemic rather than a pandemic going forward, as an endemic situation. So I think what we need to do is start maybe unilaterally, and here we can think about micro herd immunity, such as the sandboxes. We're all, looking hesitantly at Phuket, hoping that this will work, Phuket Island in Thailand, that this will be a success, and then it can slowly find its way towards new sandboxes within and beyond Thailand. And for small countries, this can, like Singapore, it can be national. And then start thinking of reciprocity, two-way, non-quarantine travel. And this, of course, is the travel bubble, which has had a sad history in this region, unfortunately, but it cannot be written off. We have to still come back to this in the future. And then finally, we can think about how we can slowly start multilateralizing these bilateral travel bubbles. I think planning for this has to start now, even though it will have to wait till the new variants are brought under control. Okay, now in the last part, last part of my talk, I want to focus on the key trends, major long-term trends, I think, facing this region, apart from climate change, and that is the digital economy and divergent demographics. We know, as Ambassador Ong said, the pandemic is accelerating our move towards the digital economy, our adoption of all kinds of new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution has been speeded up. This webinar itself is a great example of the sort of things I mean, and also all kinds of new forms of service delivery that has become, now almost standard in our day-to-day lives. And also new technologies are emerging at a rapid rate in response to this demand. But they are both positive and negative effects. The negative, of course, is the fear that it will increase inequality both within and between countries. Within countries, we know that the limited infrastructure is not accessible to everyone equally. Depending on your income, you may not be able to find the same level of access to the internet or other forms of these technologies. And this is a reality, despite the fact that more and more smartphones are sufficient to enable access when the physical, the traditional internet access is not available. I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about how it can also be inclusive. But access is unequal within countries and also between countries. Different countries, depending on their development stage, have a different level of preparedness. You can see in Singapore how things are racing ahead, while the newest members of ASEAN are still on the wrong side of the digital divide and are struggling to catch up. And perhaps the gaps will grow because of this pandemic. because the speed of their catch-up is fixed to some extent by their resources, but then the richer countries can accelerate at will because of their resources also. So that's the inequality within and between countries, made worse by skill premiums and disruption to labor markets. We know that in the new digital age, having the right set of skills can demand a very high return, right? So wage inequality is likely to rise sharply, and disruption to labor markets will be the fundamental challenge, I think, in this region. With large populous countries consisting of low-skilled workers. These are the workers that will initially be affected by automation and robotics, and they risk losing their jobs in the short run. The low-skill repetitive tasks will be the first to be affected, but then of course it will spread to other more complex activities over time. But these are the initial threats. These are the initial jobs that will be threatened with the 4IR. But we shouldn't forget that there will be a number of positive effects or inclusive impacts from the 4IR as well, right? It can do so by increasing all kinds of connectivity. Again, as I said, simply through a smartphone. These smartphones are becoming increasingly affordable. There's a fantastic study by Robert Jensen undertaken in South India about a decade ago, but still relevant, how fishermen were able to share information on prices very quickly, thereby increasing their incomes, reducing waste, improving their welfare. So there are many such examples. With agriculture, it's not just in traditional areas of manufacturing, but agriculture too. You can get better information on weather conditions, on fertilizers, on seeds, and even a sharing economy where poor small-scale farmers can now rent expensive equipment, tractors and the like, because the platform is available for them to do so by getting online. And of course, SMEs, MSMEs can also find a way to engage in e-commerce. So if you're a small firm in a remote part of a poor country, your smartphone can give you access to a global market. So all these things will offset some of those negative implications of the race towards a digital economy. But I think the net impact in the short run, short to medium term, will still be negative. I think in the long run, they might be positive, but we live in the short run, and there's a lot of adjustment costs that we will have to deal with. Now, this comes on top of the direct impacts that the pandemic is having on unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Let's not forget those direct impacts. The World Bank has already measured some of these impacts, suggesting that decades of progress in reducing poverty is now at risk. An intergenerational cycle of poverty may be set in train because of education losses in poor and remote communities who cannot access the digital age as easily. And so there might be long-term effects that we have to deal with directly as a result of the pandemic. But I think the rising unemployment amongst low-skilled workers that are not so mobile, between occupations or sectors and widening wage disparities is what we will have to address going forward. I think these adjustment costs in the short run can be greatly reduced if we allow greater factor mobility, greater capital and labor mobility. This is especially so because of these divergent demographic trends in the Indo-Pacific region that will add to the disruption and further increase the need for factor mobility. ASEAN is aging, but not all of ASEAN is aging at the same rate. The newest members, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, have relatively young populations. In the broader region, we know that East Asia, Japan, China, and Korea are aging rapidly. Their labor forces are shrinking. But then India, a populous country, has a relatively young labor force. It turns out that the younger populations happen to also be in the poorer countries, right? While aging populations can be found in both rich and poor, but you can already see how there would be mutually beneficial gains from allowing them to move around, to allowing countries that have young, bulging labor forces, but limited employment prospects because of their development stage, to move into richer, aging economies that need workers, especially at the lower end of the skills spectrum, right? So there are mutually beneficial gains to be had, by reducing these differences in capital labor ratios and therefore enabling productivity catch-up for more inclusive growth. That all sounds good, except that we have to overcome a number of barriers which are becoming more formidable as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic is reinforcing trends that were in place already, which were undermining globalization. These include nationalism and all kinds of protectionism. We're seeing the nationalism play out with the vaccines, and protectionism, of course, comes in various guises. It gets a new name every few years. After the global financial crisis, it was called rebalancing. More recently, especially with the China-US trade war, it started being called reshoring. And now there are signs that it might be called resilience. Of course, there's many good aspects of improving resilience, but you can use the term or abuse the term to actually find a way to increase your protection. And so we need to be wary that protection can come dressed up, serving good deeds, but it might not always be that way. So the pandemic is increasing the need for greater factor mobility, but at the same time, reducing the appetite of countries to pursue it. And this is the big worry. But then there will still be a need for greater factor movements, and the fear is that it will spill over into greater informal flows. The number of undocumented workers might rise, which is not good for sending or receiving countries. We know how this group has already been greatly affected by the pandemic, and the pandemic has shone a light on how many informal undocumented workers there are in this region and their plight. So if we tighten restrictions going forward, then it might spill over into these sorts of informal flows, which is not good for all concerned. So one way in which we can try and substitute for factor movements if they are not easy to do in a post-pandemic world is to try and increase trade. Trade can produce outcomes that are similar to that of factor movements, not identical, but similar. We know this from the factor price equalization theorem, where you can have wages and rentals narrowed across countries without any movement in capital or labor, but only through increased trade. This is something we can observe in the real world. It's not just a theory. And I think this is where some of the adjustment will have to come from, or more of the adjustment will have to come from, if we face greater resistance to factor movements in a post-pandemic world. And so regional agreements, I think, that involve Indo-Pacific countries like the ASEAN Economic Community, the recently signed RCEP, or the CPTPP will have to play a much more important role, both now and in the future. Of course, these agreements are finding it hard themselves to increase their labor movements directly, but they can. They are good instruments for improving trade flows. And so even if they can't directly increase factor movements, they can help by allowing trade to grow and to tie the hands of countries to resist raising protection during periods of crisis like we're going through now. Right. Okay, I'm just about hitting my limit, so let me quickly, in the next couple of minutes, summarize the key points. I think we all realize that the pandemic in Asia is not ending, but rather peaking. So whenever we talk about a post-pandemic future, we are nowhere near it, or we don't know where we are, how far we are from it. So recovery appears to be underway, but it's mixed and uncertain as long as community transmission is present. And the new variants, unfortunately, are doing that. But we have to start planning for that future, and opening borders, I think, is key to that. Of course, opening generally is increasing movement within and between borders, but most of the restrictions have been at the border. I think we can start with unilateral actions because the travel bubbles have not really caught on or got off the ground even, at a micro level, and then look to move towards bilateral agreements, the travel bubbles again with reciprocity, and then finally to try and consolidate these bilateral bubbles into multilateral arrangements, very much like we do with free trade agreements. I think the same can be applied in a staged way with the opening of borders to people movement as we do with the freeing up trade. So the pandemic's push towards the digital economy may increase inclusion in different ways, but overall, I think it will worsen inequality and unemployment in the short term, short to medium term. With the direct effects of the pandemic, I think we will face a very difficult and painful adjustment period for the next few years, perhaps up to the middle of this decade. And we need to look at ways to reduce that pain, reduce the adjustment costs. And the best way to do that would be to increase factor mobility, but this is going to be difficult in the present and in the future. This is because the pandemic's direct and indirect effects is actually increasing the need for factor mobility, but at the same time reducing its likelihood. by reinforcing the backlash against globalization. I think in this policy environment, trade liberalization through regional or other means must play a much bigger role in helping us deal with these adjustment costs, because trade can produce outcome similar to that of increased factor mobility. It can do so by equalizing the returns of both labor and capital. But in the long run, these are all about short to medium term adjustment. But in the long run, I think we will need some overhauls. Systemic changes will be required to address the challenges posed by the fourth industrial revolution and beyond. Here, we have to think about new models of education and learning, lifelong learning, to create more flexible workforces that can move more easily between occupations. In fact, the whole concept of occupation is coming under question now with the rate of technological change. So if you move towards an innovative economy or innovative society, we need to think about how our training and education systems can support that. And of course, we need deeper and more developed local capital and financial markets to sustain or finance both the investment in education and the investment in growth. These are the longer term challenges, which I haven't spoken much about, but we have to bear those in mind as well. But in the short to medium term, I think we'll have to try and see how much we can do with increasing factor mobility. But like I said, I think the environment won't be very conducive. So at the very least, we need to increase cooperation to promote trade, to try and serve as a second best adjustment mechanism towards reducing those costs as a result of digital disruption and divergent demographics. So with that, I think I've just gone over by about 4 minutes, but we thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the comments from my discussants and also all of you present. So thank you, and back to you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you, Dr. Menon, for sharing with us your views on the policy challenges facing us in the Indo-Pacific from the pandemic fallout, disruptive technologies, and divergent demographics. I now turn to Professor Sujiro Urata, Professor Emeritus at Waseda University, for his comment. Professor Urata, the screen is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to discuss Dr. Menon's very interesting presentation. I always enjoy discussing or commenting on his presentation, and this time the same. A key message that I obtained from his presentation is the importance of the international cooperation to achieve full economic recovery. Although Dr. Menon didn't mention this phrase, international cooperation, but I think this is a message that I learned from his presentation. And I'd like to make 5 points concerning the importance of international cooperation, as you see on the screen. First, vaccination. To achieve full recovery, vaccination is a key, as Dr. Menon said. With sufficient proportion of population vaccinated, herd immunity is achieved, and that is a solution for to deal with pandemic. And in order to promote vaccination, international cooperation such as COVAX is very effective and important. So here, the importance of international cooperation institution. Now move on to social safety net. During the period of pandemic, economic activities are negatively affected, causing various problems, including unemployment. Unemployment and resulting loss of income in turn cause economic and non-economic problems such as mental and physical health problems. Furthermore, unemployment increases inequality, as Dr. Menon mentioned, which in turn leads to instability in social and political system. To achieve economic recovery by reducing unemployment and inequality, provision of safety net to those suffering from the pandemic is needed. Provision of safety net requires government expenditure. However, many governments suffer from shortage of the fund. To help these governments by providing financial support, international cooperation is important. Now, third, avoiding protectionism. I guess I don't need to really elaborate on this point, but to deal with unemployment problem in developing countries with large population, as Dr. Menon emphasized, international movement of workers is effective, but international movement of workers or labor is not easy, particularly during the period of pandemic. Under such circumstances, free trading goods can be a substitute, not maybe perfect substitute, but partial substitute. Thus, it is important to achieve free trade or freer trade. One effective approach to achieve free or freer trade is to establish mega FTA such as CPTPP, RCEP. And the fourth point, labor mobility within a country. As Dr. Menon explained to us very clearly, international factor movement and international trade in goods is proven theoretically to be substitutes. Again, not maybe perfect substitutes, but substitutes. This is called factor price equalization theorem, as he mentioned. The important point in this theorem is this one assumption, that is free movement of workers between sectors within country. Not, of course, international movement is not allowed under situation, but and that is when I say movement of workers between sectors within country, it's like a labor move from agriculture to manufacturing, or labor move from textiles to automobile production. So in order to realize such situations, the movement of labor across industry, labor market needs to function smoothly. And several factors make it difficult to realize well-functioning labor market. For example, strong labor unions prevent hiring and firing of workers. One important policy here again is the provision of social safety net for temporary unemployed workers. Another problem for workers is the difficulty moving from one sector to another because working in different sectors requires different kinds of skills. For workers to acquire relevant skills, government can provide education and training, possibly with international cooperation. Now the last point, human resource development. To deal with unemployment problem and to promote economic recovery and growth, country needs capable workers, particularly those with good knowledge and skills in digital economy, as we heard from Dr. Menon. Governments need to provide education and training to the workers to upgrade their skills, to learn digital skills. Here again, possibly with international cooperation. So these are my comments, my take from Dr. Menon's presentation. I'd like to ask, I guess, one question. That is, what do you think about the role of international cooperation to deal with a problem and to achieve full recovery from the pandemic? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Urata, for your comments and your question to Dr. Menon on this issue of international assistance and cooperation here. And now turn over the screen to our commentator from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jakarta, Dr. Damuri, who is the head of the Department of Economics there. Dr. Damuri, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kwah. First, I'd like to say my appreciation for CSIS, GRIPS, and RSIS to give me an opportunity to share my thought in this forum. Also, would like to say congratulations to my colleague here, Jayant Menon, for this excellent and informative paper and presentations. I really enjoy reading your paper. So I'm gonna put my comments on the team and also on the paper into 3 points. The focus perhaps is how regional initiative and cooperations might help in overcoming those issues. The first point, it's on intermediate and short-term issues. As we have seen so far, vaccination has been shown to be an effective way in dealing with the spread of disease and also to put the economies into the right recovery path. While vaccinations does not necessarily lead to lower case, but it significantly reduces fatality, so that it can also help to start the economic recovery. 2 things become important here. The first one is the coverage as well as the pace of vaccination, and the second one is the effectiveness of the vaccine. Unfortunately, many countries in the regions still have considerable challenge to the vaccination coverage within a short time period, and moreover, those countries basically stuck with the vaccines that relatively have low effectiveness. Although the best vaccine is the one that already available, but still the effectiveness becomes also another problem. So those countries basically do not have options than implementing stricter containment measures again and again. Although the effectiveness of those stricter measures has been actually declining according to some studies, like for example from Goldstein or from Liu and others. So while on the other hand, the economic consequences are even more significant. So these kind of situations may harm the prospect of recovery in the regions, especially for developing and emerging economies in these regions. They might not be related directly to our theme of the digitalizations, but I think we cannot escape from also talking of the risk on macroeconomic issues because of this delayed economic recovery. The current situations will likely to create unbalanced economic recovery between the developing and the developed economy, and the delayed recovery process from the continuations of health issues will add a fiscal burden and debt pressures to those countries. So far, the financial sector is still relatively unaffected by the pandemic, but with this uneven economic recovery and increasing debt burdens, the risk of financial problem is looming. So even when those countries manage to have increased vaccination coverage and health issues are under control, still financial sector problems would draw back the economies to more difficult situations and to delay the economic recovery. In my opinion, regional initiative should also be prepared to deal with this kind of situations before we also, in addition to the current issues. When the pressure to financial sector in the region is multiplying, I think the countries in the region should go hand in hand to overcome these situations. And basically, the ASEAN and many other countries in the region also have some kind of schemes to deal with that issue, but they need to strengthen and also accelerate the improvements of the regional financial safety net, because in my opinion, this is also quite important and sometimes overlooked when we're talking about the economic recovery in these regions. The second point is on the post-pandemic era and digital disruptions. I think Jay already covered this issue very well. The presentation also mentioned that aside from the abundant potentials, digital technology also poses risks, including widening inequalities. Two aspects become prominent here. One aspect is human capital development, and we also already seen from the presentations the importance of this human capital in development. Another issue is on digital infrastructure and digital connectivity. And one characteristic of digital infrastructure is the cross-border nature of this connectivity. Cross-border digital connectivity actually requires a set of regulatory framework and institution that should be developed, established to realize the benefits while keeping the risk also minimum. It's a bit different than other infrastructure that can be developed in one country without trying to have a regional or cross-border characteristic. So that that kind of framework at the regional level need to be strengthened. Unfortunately, those framework is still under progress, while the cross-border aspect of digital connectivity actually have affected various areas of the economy. So regional initiative, again, could also be directed to facilitate cross-border connectivity and to overcome related situations. My third point is related to the demographic issue that the presentations also already mentions. I think it's quite timely also to discuss about this demographic issue. And a further initiative on supporting labor movement will provide a solution to the problems, both for to the aging and non-aging economies. However, this is very delicate situations. Most of the commitment on labor movements currently is only done for professionals and skilled workers. As far as I know, where there is no commitments and agreements that deal with the less skilled workers. When we're talking about MRA, Mutual Recognition Agreement among ASEAN members, for examples, they actually only deal with those skilled professions. Not the less skilled one, or let alone unskilled. Of course, labor movement of less skilled workers are actually already quite abundant and even more intensive than the skilled ones. But so far, the discussions over these issues are still very limited, and I think the of course, regional initiative can can be pursued toward that kind of directions. But I'd like to ask questions to Jay, that how should we deal with this kind of low political willingness to facilitate such labor developments? If that can provide for a solution for demographic issues and in the post-pandemic economic developments, so how we should deal with that? In addition, I also would say that there are alternatives to those labor movements issues. Instead of moving the labor, it is easier to move the capital. So facilitations for foreign direct investments might also provide alternative and a good alternative than the labor movement. Although the trade agreements and commitments in the regions also already talk and discuss about foreign direct investments, but the real issues of having more coherent and more harmonized regulatory framework of business and investments still need to be accelerated and improved. In addition to capital movement, digital technology actually can also provide opportunity for cross-border interaction and economic transactions. Digitally delivered services have become more prominent during this pandemic era and will remain in the post-pandemic era. Some studies suggest that a lot of traded services are digitally enabled, and the number is actually increasing. So this technology allows service providers, including individual service provider, to sell their services abroad without the need to move to other countries. So we now hear a lot about virtual migrants or virtual nomads. That would becomes more and more important in the future. Indeed, the level and the magnitude is still small, given the relatively low technology adaptation in many countries in this region. But with supportive policy environments, perhaps digital technology may offer a good alternative for labor movement in the future. So with that, I conclude my talk, and I'm happy to discuss further in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Damuring. We have several questions, and I'll try to group them. Let me first group those that relate to the issue of the pandemic fallout here. So, let me first read a couple of comments that have been made with no questions. One is from Rana in RSIS. Vaccines are global public goods, and we need international cooperation for optimal supply. That's just a comment which you can bear in mind. And another says that the G7 pledges 1 billion doses. WHO says we need 11 billion doses. And the third says COVAX has not been very successful. So those are comments that have been posted. But I think the key question here comes back to the issue of vaccines. And this is posted by my colleague, Dr. Alex Arifinto from our RSIS Indonesia program here. And this is not only to Dr. Menon, but I think also to Professor Urata, who has mentioned this issue of vaccines. And the question is, do you think we need additional measures to detect and prevent new variants from spreading worldwide? Perhaps an early surveillance system by placing in-country WHO, CDC officials in high-risk countries that are more likely to produce new variant mutations, or developing new treatments like quinine and so on that would cut potential person-to-person transmission and require traveling to high-risk countries to take this new drug along with vaccinations. And there's another one here about, we are from Rafael Diwantor, we are witnessing G7 implementing entrance policies based on vaccines of certain brands. I think here, this may be a reference to China preferring those who have had their Sinovac. The question is, how should we understand this in terms of post-pandemic world cooperation and recovery here? And I think, yeah, there's one final late one from an anonymous attendee. One factor which cannot be underestimated is the effort by the Biden administration to step up global distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Do the presenters have any recent data measuring the rate of economic recovery tied to overall vaccine distribution at the country level? In situations where vaccine hesitancy exists and governments have already attempted to persuade populations to receive the vaccines without imposing it, can targeted strategies aimed at vaccinating workers in key economic sectors be considered to kickstart recovery? So I think here we have got a number of interesting questions on COVID, about the Biden administration, about vaccinating others, about the G7 implementing entrance policies, and about early warning. So, Dr. Menon, do you want to start and also take in some of the points that our two commentators have made? Then I'll turn to our two commentators, Professor Urata and Dr. Damuri, for their comments on these series of questions on the pandemic fallout as a policy challenge.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And let me start by thanking my discussants and good friends, and still good friends after their comments, for their very useful pointers on my paper. And actually, it's reminded me, anyone who hasn't got a copy of the paper, please contact the organizers or contact me, and I'm happy to send you a copy. Including the presentation. So let me first start by responding to some of the questions that that Professor Urata and Professor Damuri raised. I think Shu mentioned the role of international cooperation, and I think he himself has clearly highlighted the importance of it. And I think it is true that we face a global pandemic that would have been best addressed by a coordinated global response right from the very start. And unfortunately, unlike previous crises, the global response to this one has been seriously wanting. If you remember, at the very start of soon after the pandemic started, the G7 could not even come out with a communique because President Trump insisted on calling it the Wuhan virus and so on, and such sorts of things did not help in sort of producing a coordinated global response. This is a great pity. I mean, we didn't see such discrepancies with the global financial crisis, for instance, where there was a lot more coordinated, concerted efforts. And this time around, we were denied that kind of response when it was needed, perhaps even more than with the GFC before. So basically, yes, I think we needed it. We could have benefited greatly from it. We didn't get it. So now, of course, we've all scrambling around with second and third best options, most of it has been national. There's been some regional efforts, but hopefully, having missed the opportunity to deal with the pandemic outbreak, we hope that more cooperation can help with the distribution of vaccines. Again, the record so far has not been good, but improving. And I think one of your questioners also mentioned the US and their distribution of vaccines as playing a part, and we hope to see much more of that going ahead. Some countries have, allocations to cover 200 or 300% of their population, which they should release to others that are struggling to vaccinate 1% or 2% of their population. So, especially in Africa. So, so there's a lot more that international cooperation can do and should do. I think Jose also mentioned, highlighted the role of unskilled, informal workers. And I think this is where the problem really lies in ASEAN. Most of the movement is not in the skilled categories. Of course, the ASEAN Economic Community, through the MRAs, is dealing with skilled worker movements, but we know that the majority of worker movement is in the low skill categories, and this is not covered. But at least ASEAN, I guess, is trying to deal with labor mobility when RCEP and even the CPTPP have basically thrown up their hands, right? So that's a positive part of ASEAN's approach, but it's a difficult area and it's politically sensitive. You've got small countries like Singapore sitting next door to populous countries like Indonesia. But I think progress would probably have to happen through bilateral agreements. We've seen one example of a successful case, and I've included this in the paper. Successful but controversial more recently is the Singapore-India SECA, which has provisions for long-term visas, which is often misinterpreted to mean open access to permanent residency or citizenship and so on, which is not true. But again, this is a classic case of vested interests using fear and insecurity and uncertainty to make their case, to increase barriers towards factor movements, right? Raising fears about massive inflow of workers who end up being citizens and so on and so forth. And this is what we'll have to deal with a lot more, I think, as this pandemic lasts longer and longer. And we should be attuned to these sorts of fear-mongering and rise above it. But I think these sort of bilateral agreements can be a start, to build sort of the small numbers approach, two countries seeing mutual interests, coming to agreement, and then slowly adding more countries. But mostly, I think it'll involve, again, unilateral actions. Singapore is, again, another good example. It needs foreign workers. It's decided to open its borders in a calibrated way to allow the return of its workers, nurses that it needs, and so on, and strengthening domestic protocols to allow it. So I think that's the way forward. But as I said, the fear is if we don't do that, workers will still move and respond to need, but through illegal channels. And so much of that happened before the pandemic. I fear it'll grow in a post-pandemic world if regulations are further tightened. And that will not benefit sending or receiving countries. But it has happened and will probably grow if we are not going to formalize the avenues for labor movements. I think Jose also mentioned, yes, if labor is difficult, then FDI should increase. I agree. Maybe FDI is much easier, of course, but countries are already generally quite open to FDI, the ones that want it, and the ones that don't are increasing their self-reliance, right? This is what reshoring is all about. It's reversing FDI. And that is what we will have to contend with going forward. This call, I mean, not just in the US, but also in this region, right? With subsidies being provided for countries to have their firms return home in Japan and elsewhere. So that's what we are faced with. And in India, with the new self-sufficiency mantra, that's, not just in India, but, growing in popularity. All of this is about, reducing outflows of capital, labor, technology. And this is, going to grow the longer this pandemic lasts and will linger for many years after this pandemic is declared over. And that's what I'm concerned about going forward. Now, very quickly, I think a number of other comments were mentioned. Actually, there were so many that were raised, but I think let me just say that, I think the point was made about how can we improve our detection of the new variants. I think I'm not a health specialist. Actually, I thought the questioner raised a number of very interesting options that we could pursue. Having experts from various countries situated in high-risk locations, as long as these countries are willing to allow them, I think that's a good thing. I hope again countries are open to this, but I don't know if they will be. I think what we've seen with the new variants is that by the time they become variants of concern, as the WTO terms it, it's already often too late. So by the time they show up in large numbers and they are tagged as being of concern, countries then scramble to close their borders against those countries. It's far too late, right? So it's inherently designed to fail, this closing of borders or selectively. And that's what we need to overcome somehow. I don't know if we can. Maybe having experts located in these countries might help somewhat, but I don't know if we can do that. But I think it does highlight how selective border closures or travel bans are doomed to fail, right? Because it's like viral videos that are banned by governments. By the time the government tries to pull them down, it's already spread, right? The horse has bolted. And the same thing applies here. And I think this is also true about getting better medications. Hopefully we can do that. And I think it's been said that, this pandemic will be over when we stop treating it as a pandemic. And if we can bring the fatality rate or mortality rate down to the levels of the influenza, that's when we can all start going back to living a relatively normal life again. And I think if medications, like I think is mentioned quinine for malaria, medications can also play that role in addition to vaccination, then we will get there sooner. I think that's all I'll say for now and leave it to my discussants to add. So thank you. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Professor Urata, would you like to add your comments to the questions that have been posed about the pandemic fallout?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, Jay did respond very well to all the questions. Let me adjust 2 points. One is that this is a global problem. In other words, you cannot just solve this problem yourself. I mean, everybody has to overcome this problem. So it is very important for everyone, all the countries, to realize that's the situation. Or so-called maybe this is an issue of external economies. Unless everybody else deals with this problem successfully, we can never go back to a normal life. That's first point. A second point is a very, I think, encouraging development is the at the WTO, if I understand correctly, waiver of IPR protection of vaccine, which would, I think, accelerate the distribution of vaccine. So I think this is encouraging development. Just wanted to mention. Thank you.
Dr. Damori, any comments, responses from you?
Yeah, maybe on the vaccine, vaccine and vaccination rollout. As we already know that this is the key for dealing with the pandemic and also the key for economic recovery. But often we forget when we talk about vaccine is that that involves two things: the research and productions. And we always forgot that the production side is also a difficult part, and because vaccine is basically a small part of the pharmaceutical industry. Before the pandemic, the capacity for vaccine production is only less than 7 billion dosage annually, and it less than 40% of those capacity was actually utilized. So today we have a demands of 2 times of those capacities, and the capacity could not really be increased easily. But I think it's only about timing. When the vaccinations can also reach the less developed or developing countries, because after the advanced economies already quite satisfied with their vaccination period, vaccinations ever, then they will also have those developing and less developed economies. But of course, it would delay the vaccination, and it would also delay the economic recovery ever. It would prolong the crisis, and it might also cost the developing economies dearly in terms of their capacity, and also perhaps macroeconomic issues, and also social economic issues. I think that that's my comment on the discussions about vaccines so far.
Well, thank you. Time is running out, but I think we have time for one final question, and this is from my RSIS colleague, Monteclaros, and it's a general question about managing the COVID-19 crisis. What do you, Dr. Menon, and our 2 commentators think are the untapped research avenues which more researchers, think tanks should be pursuing today to add on to the discourse on managing this COVID-19 crisis? Are there any topics, methodologies which strike you as low-hanging fruits? I think that may be a good concluding comment for this session here. So, Dr. Menon, if you have got any 1 minute or 2 minute replies, and then Urata, Professor Urata, and Dr. Damori. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, very quickly, I'm sure there are lots of things in the medical field that can be done, but I'm not an expert in that area. So I'll just stick to policy, economic policy. I think one area clearly that has perplexed me to some extent is how there is so much resistance to border movements. You could understand it initially, that's how the pandemic started, but even before the variants came on board, there was so much resistance to opening borders, when domestic movements were being eased. So just like the economic profession and the multilateral agencies have been successful in selling the benefits of trade liberalization over the years as being mutually beneficial, I think there's a role to play here in reducing the bias against border movements for people or services, or traditional services. New services, digital trade has been booming, but in people movement, I think we need to try and remove this inherent bias that we have to try and sell the benefits of greater people movement, or at least reduce the asymmetry and overcome the prejudice against people movement, when in fact we know that there are ways in which borders can be opened while still maintaining health risks in check and boosting economic recovery. So I think think tanks can address this issue of how we overcome the inherent bias against border restrictions on movement compared to domestic movement. That would be a very positive thing in preparing for the post-pandemic recovery. Let me stop there.
Professor Urata, would you have any comments on this issue? Or what else can we as think tanks do to contribute to this discourse?
Well, I'm pretty much encouraged by this development. That is the huge number of articles just from, say, economics. Of course, there are many more from other, areas like medicine, but even economics, there is a now journal called COVID Journal, and there are so many articles from different perspectives. I myself wrote a paper using a night light, from the remote sensing data, which I didn't really know until I searched around, and the natural science people have used that kind of technique to do some kind of other, studies. But now we can apply this new, at least to me, as a new technology, to examine the impacts of, say, COVID on economic activities. So I've been encouraged by this recent development. Now I think it's time to really take advantage of all these papers to use them to formulate policies. Maybe we haven't reached that point yet, but there are so many papers that we should really look at all these papers to find out what they have found, and then try to use some of the interesting academic outcome to formulate policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And well, my comment to that is that we may be on this treadmill. As we try to formulate our policies, the treadmill is moving and we are slowly running faster and faster. So that's a challenge for us. But Dr. Damori, any concluding thoughts and comments on what more we can do as a think tank?
Yeah, I think just one that the pandemic has shown us that the digital technology offer us a lot of things, including also how we can engage to each other without moving moving from one location to another location. But of course, there are many challenges to that, and then I think we need to think about it in a comprehensive way, and then find many other areas that hasn't really been discussed or hasn't really been formulated well in order to push forward the development.
Well, thank you. And I think our Zoom time has run out. I apologize to our questioners if the questions have not been fully answered or satisfactorily answered. To the 2 or 3, we've asked whether these presentations are available online and whether the papers and presentation by Dr. Menon is available. I will leave it to my colleagues in the RSS events team to type a reply. It remains for me now to thank Dr. Menon, Professor Urata, and Dr. Damuri for their comments, the presentation, and ask you to join me in thanking them. The next presentation in this series should be about next month, July, and I invite you to keep a lookout for the date and time and subject of that next session. So I thank you all and wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much.